As you all probably know, this month, February, is Black History Month. Black History Month has been officially recognized by the President every year since 1976, but its history goes back much further than that, and we'll take a look at some of that history in a moment. The Black Lives Matter movement is an important part of this month's observances, so we need to take a look at that too. Locally, many of us have often attended the Black Lives Matter vigils in Warrenton on Saturday mornings. I've been there many times, but I haven't been in recent months for a couple of reasons. Let me tell you about them. First, it's been cold, and the prospect of standing out there in the cold for an hour wasn't very attractive. But more than that, the vigils began to take on a nasty confrontational tone that I found troublesome. After the vigils had been going on for, a year or so, a group opposed to the idea of Black Lives Matter began to gather across the street over there in front of the courthouse. At first, they just held up signs opposing the idea of Black Lives Matter. And as one vigil ended, I walked over and thanked one of them for being there to express their opinion. Let all voices be heard. But within a few weeks, they began to shout epithets at us, often using bad language. They shouted and made noise to drown out our speakers. The police had to become involved, and then the town started to get concerned about the expense. That's when I dropped out. I just didn't want to take part in something confrontational like that. The history of treatment of blacks in America is not a very pretty one. Originally captured and brought to this country to be slaves, they were freed when slavery ended with the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. But they were still heavily discriminated against well into the 20th century with things like Jim Crow laws and grandfather clauses to determine who could vote and so forth. The Civil Rights Act of 1965 was supposed to correct all these injustices, but they have not gone away, not even today in 2022. The killing of George Floyd by a Minneapolis police officer in 2019, which is caught on somebody's cell phone video and seen countless times around the world, made it clear that there was still much injustice directed at Black Americans. President Biden promised to address these injustices, and he's in the process of appointing a Black woman to the U.S. Supreme Court. He's working from a list of extremely well-qualified Black women jurists. Let us hope the appointment process goes well and successfully. Just this past week, I'm sure you know from seeing the news, there have been bomb threats against several historically Black colleges and universities, or HBCUs as they are known, including Howard University here in Washington, D.C. This means the schools have to go on lockdown. Everybody stays home or shelters in place, classes are canceled, and so forth. What point can there be in putting out such a threat except outright hatred of Black people? We know there is hatred of Black people when we remember the demonstration which took place in Charlottesville a few years back. The white supremacist demonstrators had it in for many minority groups. If you remember, they were shouting, "Jews will not replace us," as they marched in the streets. You probably also remember that a woman was killed. She was a counter-demonstrator when one of the white supremacists drove his car directly into the line of counter-demonstrators. More recently, the killing of Ahmaud Arbery also captured our attention as another egregious murder of a Black citizen. In February of 2020, Arbery was jogging in a Georgia neighborhood when 3 armed white men began to pursue him in 2 pickup trucks, and they took video of what they were doing. After they had chased him for some distance, the 3 men stopped Arbery, assaulted him, and finally shot him 3 times. No arrests were made until the video began to circulate, and the 3 men were arrested and charged in May. They were finally convicted, and just last month, 2 of them, a father and son, were sentenced to life imprisonment plus 20 years with no possibility of parole, and the third was sentenced to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 30 years. Just this past week, lawyers for the father and son reached a plea agreement which will help them avoid federal hate crime charges. I couldn't figure out what difference this is going to make to them since they are in prison for the rest of their lives anyway. It's important that we remember our own experiences in learning about the treatment of Blacks in our country. When I went to public school, it was all white. Black kids went to another school. I have no idea where it was. I didn't know any Black kids. We learned almost nothing about Black people in school. I remember learning about George Washington Carver, a black chemist who developed many new uses for peanuts. What we were taught about him was that wasn't it amazing that a black person could do such important work? We didn't learn anything about him personally or very much about the work. I later did some research and learned that he had been born into slavery in about 1864 in Diamond, Missouri. They didn't keep good birth records for black people, so the date of his birth is not known for certain. He died in 1943. I knew before that there were people living when I was born in 1940 who had lived in slavery. Now I know that George Washington Carver was one of them. Think of him the next time you eat a peanut. George Washington Carver. Another name you should know is Carter Woodson. He was the founder of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. Woodson was born in 1875, and his parents had been slaves. He had to work in the coal mines for a number of years, but later he was able to attend Berea College and the University of Chicago. Then he obtained a PhD from Harvard in 1912, only the second black person ever to do so. The first was W.E.B. Du Bois, who was born in 1868 and died in 1963. You might remember Du Bois as the author of The Souls of Black Folk, which was published in 1903. Writing then at the beginning of the 20th century, he wrote that racism would be the defining problem of the 20th century in America. Little did he know that it would still be a defining problem now more than 100 years later. So where are we now in February 2022? At least we know we have a lot of work to do. If we are realistic with ourselves and with one another, we know it is not going to be easy, and it is not going to happen quickly. We need to examine differences between the circumstances of whites and blacks, as well as other people of color, in our country. There are many differences. There are differences in income. There are differences in wealth, which is related to income, but not exactly the same thing. There are differences in educational levels. There are differences in where we live and where we go to school. There are even differences in where we go to the grocery store, as you will know if you've been reading the news about efforts to establish a new grocery store in Southeast Washington. There are differences in health and health care and life expectancy. All these things are intricately interrelated. Think about it. If you live in a neighborhood where there are liquor stores and convenience stores but no grocery stores, you are more likely to eat beef jerky and soda pop than fresh vegetables and fruits, and that contributes to your health, or lack of it. What should we be doing about this, you and I? First, let's be aware. Let's think about these things and talk about them with one another. Let's redouble our efforts to be in touch with black people, which haven't been very effective in the past. Let's hope the 21st century will be better for black Americans than the centuries leading up to it. And let's each do our part to help make it so. That's some of what I think about Black Lives Matter these days. What do you think? Let the congregational dialogue begin.